I Am Tuesday is filmed before a studio audience.
Where am I? Well, it looks like my microphone is here, so I might as well do a video while I figure out how to get back into space. Hello everyone, it is Tuesday, I Am Tuesday, and today we are going to be talking about Stormfront, Book 1 of the Dresden Files. More specifically, we're going to be talking about how it works as both a standalone novel and the jumping off point for the series as a whole, and how this dynamic differs from a lot of other fantasy series I've read. That being said, this video is a collection of my opinions on this subject. I'll do my best to support those opinions, but I'm totally open to hearing what y'all have to say about it as well. If you want to continue the conversation, please do so in the comments down below. I read all of them and respond to most, so go ahead and let me know your thoughts. I will warn you though that I'm still pretty early on in the series, so please try to avoid spoilers as much as possible. Beyond that, be sure to like and subscribe. If I get enough of you to do so, I just might be able to find a way out of here. Anyway, back to everybody's favorite magical private detective. For those of you who somehow didn't know, The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher is a wildly popular urban fantasy detective series set in Chicago, which is where I seem to be right now. It follows the exploits of one Harry Dresden, a sarcastic private detective slash wizard who constantly finds himself only a few steps away from certain death and, more concerningly, personal bankruptcy. Through his eyes and inner monologue, we are able to take a glimpse into the realms of magic hiding in plain sight, while enamoring ourselves to the dangers and wonders these realms represent. You already knew that though. It's almost a statistical certainty. Even if you've never heard of the phrase Harry Dresden Wizard before, I can almost guarantee the long shadow of Dresden's influence has touched your life in some way or another, even if you haven't recognized this effect. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that The Dresden Files is the series that every other modern urban fantasy story has been influenced by. It's like the Dreadnought. Everything written in the subgenre beforehand almost seems quaint by comparison, and everything written afterwards has either been a reinvention of or a reaction to Jim Butcher's series. This is the tale that everyone in the urban fantasy space must hold themselves up to, and I have yet to see anyone come close to its might. However, there is a universe in which this isn't the case, where Harry Dresden Wizard exists as a charming but brief side note in the greater history of fantasy storytelling. For those who have read the series, you might already know what I'm getting at, but let me explain for anyone who hasn't. Stormfront, the first novel in the series, doesn't read like it's the first novel in a series. There aren't any grand aspersions to epic narratives looming in the distance. There aren't any after-credit scenes where a big bad villain does something evil that we never acknowledge again. Hell, there's hardly even any loose threads left hanging to allow for sequel bait. Instead, we get a tightly packed Lego set of a story, where every piece inside the box is slotted into place by the time the book is over. Whatever is left hanging at the end, you know, that bag of extra bits you're pretty sure you don't need but refuse to get rid of, can easily be chalked up to a necessary oversight in Butcher's explanation. One that allows the world the story takes place in to feel fuller. That Dresden's story is just one of the things going on in a living and vibrant world. So let's start with that. Pretend it's 2000 and this newfangled book by that Jim Butcher guy has just hit shelves. You, the average American shopper, have no idea what this book is. Harry Dresden isn't some megalithic figure in the wider fantasy landscape. Instead, he's just a dude working a dangerous job for not enough pay, because he's one of the only people on Earth qualified to do it. It, of course, being the solving of magical murder mysteries. You decide to pick it up off the shelf, throw it in your standard American book shopping cart, make your way past the vacant, suicidal gazes of the cashiers at the Walmart book market for all your book shopping needs, and drive home. Once there, you warm up Stormfront by Jim Butcher in the microwave, ready to dig in, and then sit down on your sofa for a good read, only to be pleasantly surprised by what is held within its pages. You see, many modern fantasy series of the past 30 years have had their debut novels written with multiple sequels in mind. Take The Blade itself as an example, or perhaps Malice by John Gwynne. The idea that these books ought to operate as standalone, that either of them would be better if they were self-contained in a tight little bow, feels ludicrous. If you, the average American shopper, were to try and argue this point, people would rightly look at you like you were crazy, and then promptly stop listening to whatever else you had to say about literature. Even as far back as 1990 and the publication of The Eye of the World, we can see that these massive stories were written with sequels in mind, even though Jordan seemed to hedge his bets a little bit by bow-ending some stuff in the final chapters. So logic based on publication history would imply this is how people should write. That's high fantasy though, you might say, or at least higher fantasy than the Dresden Files. What about an urban fantasy example? Surely those authors are better at following the advice of YouTube writing experts when it comes to debut novels. Well, even this stinker was obviously written with sequels in mind. It may even have the worst sequel bait of the lot. There's something that makes Stormfront feel different then, but what? Well, it really comes down to tropes and genre. As I mentioned, the example that I gave 2 paragraphs ago were both more epic in scope. As their stories unravel, they transform into more fate of the world hangs in the balance types of affairs. The scope of their given circumstances demands a wider breadth of importance, begging for more details, more pages, and most importantly, more sequels. By comparison, Stormfront is a magical detective thriller, and that simple fact of a genre change makes all the difference. Despite being popularly classified as urban fantasy, setting the standard for the subgenre as a whole, I would argue that the first couple Dresden Files novels, Stormfront especially, position themselves squarely in the realm of pulp detective fiction. They throw a novel twist into the formula, the magical otherworld, hidden in plain sight, but they aren't necessarily trying to be urban fantasy stories. That might seem confusing, but stay with me. All forms of popular fiction hold tropes inherent to their genres, and any writer worth their salt is able to utilize those tropes in new and interesting ways in order to effectively tell a story. For example, one of the tropes inherent to the urban fantasy subgenre is the fish out of water sense of wonder a character feels when being introduced to the magical otherworld created by the author. This usually involves someone previously unaware of the true nature of reality, following a hero's journey through the fantastic and whimsical, if sometimes dangerous, world of their wildest imagination. They're usually a young person, in their tweens or early teens, who has to learn on the fly about how special they are in relation to the special world they now find themselves in order to defeat the big bad guy. Harry Dresden is a little different. When reading through Stormfront for the first time, I kind of just imagined Dresden to be this grizzled old man in, at best, a 28-year-old working man's body. He never eats, is thin as a board, and gets the tar beat out of him on a semi-regular basis. Certainly a far cry from the YA power fantasy provided by other stories in the urban fantasy subgenre. Instead of being the fish out of water, Dresden starts the series as an established and known actor within the wider magical landscape. The powers and factions aren't revealed to us in detail with a sense of childlike wonder, but rather we have information given to us on a need-to-know basis, filtered through the jaded lens of a working stiff, doing his best not to die while also doing his job, which is a pretty large divergence, all things considered. Why though? Why does Jim Butcher stray so heavily from the established tropes of the genre? Because it's not urban fantasy. Sure, it has all of the trappings of such, witches, wizards, vampires, fairies, black magic, but on a mechanical, technical level, we are reading Sherlock Holmes. Surprise! I grew up reading mystery novels, okay, so... Now, if only I could solve the mystery of how to get out of here, especially in a way that doesn't involve me having to move from in front of the camera. Some of my earliest memories involve Sherlock Holmes stories, by the way. Those and Andrea Camilleri's Montalbano series.
One of the things I've noticed to be commonplace in long-running detective series is the ever-growing cast of extended characters who operate in the main character's sphere, though in a very different way to other fictional stories. Whereas a lot of higher fantasy characters feel like they enter into and exit from stories with the sole purpose of driving plot or tension. Most of the tertiary characters in detective novels are just kinda hanging out. You'll have your recurring minor villains, enemies to allies, friends to lovers, among others.
The world feels bigger because not all of the extended cast of characters appear in every story. They just kind of arrive sometimes if they're personally or economically involved in the conflict of the week. Because of this detective fiction dynamic, Stormfront is able to put up walls around its narrative, effectively cordoning itself off from the rest of the fantasy world it takes place in. As readers, we assume there is more going on outside of our purview. Harry is beholden to the White Council, after all, and there's a bunch of references to vampire factions and old-school mobsters. But with how the novel is written, we don't really care about them in any formulative sense, only getting drawn into the wider politicking of it all later on in the series. For now, those forces exist as an ancillary detail to the more immediate, why do people keep magically exploding mystery, as opposed to wider narrative threads that need to be tugged. By limiting its scope to the inner mechanism of its own conflict and providing outside detail only in the sense that it helps to flesh out character, Stormfront provides for the creation of a breakneck mystery thriller that tricks you into thinking that it's an urban fantasy adventure. The sleight of hand is so complete that it sucks you in and makes it impossible to stop reading, while at the same time convincing millions that this is what urban fantasy should be. There's a reason why I claimed the Dresden Files were a cut above at the top of the video, and that has in large part to do with its melding of genre. The tropes of the hard-boiled detective novel help to reinforce Stormfront's detachment from its own wider world, as the serialization of detective fiction is baked into the book's very bones. This mechanical skeleton is then wrapped in the flesh of fantasy and myth to create a literary homunculus that took the world by storm. The reason why so many people have tried and failed to rip off Jim Butcher's work is because they usually understand this, but don't fully understand this. And it's the combination of the two that sets our wizard from the Windy City apart from all the rest. Stormfront gets a 6 out of 10. The books tend to get better as they go. Speaking of Chicago, how the f do I get out of here? Well, that can't be good. I mean, I guess every door is an exit from somewhere.